for joining us tonight for a discussion of this vital issue at the intersection of environmental, public health, racial equality. Across the country, disproportionate exposure to pollution has threatened the health of people of color, from the Gulf Coast towns in the shadows of petrochemical plants to the indigenous communities in the West. It is well known that factories, refineries, landfills, and hazardous waste facilities are more likely to be placed in Black, brown, and poor communities. Tonight, we are honored to have Professor Jonathan Rosenbloom here to share his knowledge on these issues with us. He is a distinguished environmental law scholar from Vermont Law School and Albany Law School. He teaches sustainability, land use, and racial justice. He has written numerous books, published articles about land use, sustainability, food security, racial justice, and more. And I don't know how he does all that and looks so young. He is also the executive director of the Sustainable Development Code, which is a comprehensive land use code designed to provide local governments with the best sustainable practices in many aspects of land use. So the link to that will be on the library here, and I urge you all to take a look at it. It's an amazing and accessible look at the way towns and cities could address many of our pressing issues like water quality. And just reading a few sections, I can see how many of these ideas would be helpful to Vermont towns and cities. Well, with that, let's hear from Professor Rosenbloom.
Thank you very much, Anna, Michelle, Kellogg Hubbard Library, and the League of Women Voters. It's an honor to be here with you all tonight. And just so you all know, technology is fantastic, right? Zoom has great filters. They make you look 20 years younger. It's great. So that's another technological skill I have as well. As I said, it's great to be here. We're going to be talking tonight about zoning and equity and health. But for over 100 years, we've known in the United States that facially discriminatory land practices, so these are provisions that expressly discriminate based on race, are prohibited by the US Constitution. In a 1917 case called Buchanan versus Warley, the United States Supreme Court overturned a Louisville law that prohibited Black homeowners from purchasing or leasing a home on a block where white people own the majority of houses. Since then, and for over a century, explicit race-based zoning has been illegal in the United States. Yet when we look around at our cities, our counties, our towns, and communities, many are not only segregated, but also plagued with systemic inequality and racial injustice. And so what's happening? And important for our discussion here tonight, what role does zoning play in exacerbating those inequalities, particularly when it comes to health? So to explore this, I'll start by connecting some of the dots between health and equity. This is something that has been well documented, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time on it, but I'm going to focus on a few significant points that are particularly relevant to zoning. Now, but this is not to say, of course, that these are the only ones, because again, there are a lot of these and there are a lot of studies indicating various aspects of health and how, that's supposed to be health, not health, how between health, there is an inequality among various ethnicities, classes, and race. Then we'll take it a step further and make the important connection between health, not heath again, equity, and zoning. That begins with a description of how zoning operates in a covert way, and how that covert way also ultimately results in a discriminatory system. We'll then briefly look at the weaponization of zoning, which directly leads to the zoning we see today. And we'll look at some of that zoning that plagues the health of communities in inequitable ways, notwithstanding the United States Supreme Court direction that local codes may not discriminate based on race. Now, like what I was saying about health before, while there are many areas of zoning that we could look at, I just want to kind of touch upon four. In fact, one of them was mentioned by Anna in the introduction, and that's the siting of hazardous and toxic facilities. Then we'll talk a little bit about food security and sovereignty, pedestrian mobility, and finally, home ownership. Again, these are obviously not the only ones out there. There are others that are very much important to health, such as zoning's regulation of potable water, zoning regulation of stormwater management and flooding, zoning regulation of energy and of sewer and so on. But I just want to highlight four just to kind of give us a flavor of making that connection between health, equity, and zoning. And so hopefully these four will also, though, give us a picture of how complicated this issue of health and equity is relative to zoning and what the role of zoning plays in that. Then for each of these, I also want to lay out a different way of thinking about zoning and how zoning can actually be a force for positive good, not only going forward, but also looking backwards and looking at some of the past discrimination and how we can begin to talk about reparations and other forms of addressing past harms. So let's begin with making the connection between, again, health and equity. Now, as I mentioned, that many studies illustrate the deep connection between health and equity. The studies do so in a variety of ways that hone in on many narrow areas of health. I'm going to focus in on these 8 that are on the left side of the screen, but I'm not going to dive deep into them. Nonetheless, it is a lot of information, but the point at the end of these 8 is really just to get across the idea that across the spectrum of health, equity is really a victim when we start to regulate health, particularly through zoning. So let's start at the end with life expectancy. So when we look at life expectancy, the CDC stated in 2019 that there was about a 4-year difference between Black individuals and white individuals in the United States. In 2020, that increased to about 6 years. And some of that is due to the inequities that are playing out because of COVID. That's at one end of the life spectrum. We can look at this at the completely other end of the spectrum as well when we see it, and that's infant mortality. This chart here on the right side of your screen is graphing out infant mortality rates by race and ethnicity in 2018, and you can see that non-Hispanic Black individuals are approximately 2 times more likely to have a high, or 2 times more likely to have an infant mortality rate than non-Hispanic white individuals, and then Native Americans are quite high as well. In addition to infant mortality rates, even maternal fatality rates are quite high based on equity charts as well. So you can see on the right-hand side, we again have Black individuals in 2018 and 2019, and it is about double the rate of white individuals. Pedestrian fatalities is another area that I, again, want to highlight because we're going to talk about pedestrian mobility just a moment. But again, here we have a pretty big disparity, particularly when it comes to Native Americans. You can see in the middle, almost the middle of the screen, it says total population. This is the total traffic deaths per 100,000 across the United States from 2015 to 2019. White individuals are a bit below the average. African-American, Black individuals are a bit above the average. Native Americans are significantly above the average, almost 3 times more likely to have a pedestrian fatality than not only the average, but also white individuals as well. We're going to talk about food security and sovereignty. And so I wanted to look at diabetes. And you can see in this chart that Black individuals have a percentage have a much higher percentage, almost double the percentage of white individuals to have diabetes in the United States. Same with Hispanic individuals, and then Korean individuals are on the right-hand side of the screen, also quite a bit higher. Asthma as well, very similar statistics, but here there is a little bit closer with white individuals and Hispanic individuals. And then again, Black individuals have quite a bit higher percentage of cases of asthma in the United States. Heat stress. So this is an important one for purposes of land use, because this is really pertaining to the amount of concrete and asphalt areas, but also the amount of buildings. Do we have any trees to kind of abate some of the heat that is coming from the power of the sun? And a 2020 study found that 94% of 108 cities that were in this study that were also formerly redlined neighborhoods. So those of you who are unfamiliar with redlined neighborhoods, these were redline maps that were done in the 1930s, 40s, and a little bit into the 50s that were really initially designed to inform banks as well as the federal government as to who the federal government should back in terms of supporting those loans. And many of these instances, if not all of them, the sole criteria for being a redlined area was the individuals living in that area. Were they African Americans? Were they immigrants? Were they Jewish? And a couple others. There's a really wonderful website called Mapping Inequality, and I can get you the link for that, but it's called Mapping Equality. It's out of the University of Richmond, where you can not only view these maps, but more important or more relevant for this point I'm making right now is you can actually click on the redlined area and look at the justification that was used to create that redlined area. And in there, you'll see exactly what they're talking about. And that's when they say, this is a redlined area because it is 100% Jewish area, or it is a predominantly African-American area, or something along those lines. Those areas today, there have been a number of studies that have indicated that even those red line maps were found, were made unlawful in the 1968 Fair Housing Act, that those areas that were formerly redlined continue to suffer not only segregation in that they continue to predominantly be low-income individuals, African-American individuals, but also there is discrimination happening where they are getting different services than other areas. In this particular study, they were looking at how warm it gets. And so meaning that, again, looking at what is on the ground. Is it mostly concrete or is it vegetation and that kind of thing? So here it says they were nearly 5 degrees warmer on average than a non-redlined neighborhood, though some cities showed differences as much as almost 13 degrees difference, which of course, it's really even hard to think about that level of difference when we start getting into some of the summer weather and we start talking about climate change and increases in temperatures and what that's going to look like in some of these areas today. And finally, something that is indirectly connected to health, but very important for purposes of health across almost every study that looks at this, and that is wealth. And you can see in the United States, white individuals continue to have a significant gap over both African Americans and Latinx individuals in terms of wealth. And in the United States, one of the most important asset for purposes of wealth is real estate ownership in the United States. Obviously, when you move up in income brackets, it changes, but in the United States across the board, for the most part, it is a real estate. And that, of course, plays directly into zoning. So that's a lot of information. But again, the point of all this, and we can talk about any one of these, and there's a variety of ways to look at any one of them. But the idea is that it begins to paint a picture. And it's a picture in which there are clearly winners and there are clearly losers when it comes to critical health statistics and statistics that bear on the health of people across the country and how that breaks down rather based on race. So let's now turn to connecting zoning to all of this. Now, typically, zoning does not result in spectacles of violence that make visible other discriminatory areas of law, such as policing or evictions, right? It's far more covert. It's exerting control and exercising inequality through the mundane and everyday. Yet for every death from police violence against people of color, there are hundreds of deaths from air and water pollution, obesity, malnutrition, and others. So to start a conversation on zoning, I think it's important to recognize zoning's unusual place in US policy. And that's that on one hand, it's ubiquitous. It regulates dozens of actions that we encounter each day in our lives, and we find it in thousands of local governments across the country. It influences big decisions such as where we live, how we live, who we see, to very small things such as paint colors or types of wood or how tall your grass can be. But on the other hand, most of us don't typically think or maybe even know about zoning, or maybe you've never looked at our zoning codes, right? Notwithstanding its importance and significance on our lives. And so I had mentioned lawn. So take the mowing of lawn, which is a fairly ordinary and innocuous activity, but that activity can be and is regulated by the zoning code in a variety of jurisdictions across the country. And it can be done in a way that not only impacts when and how a homeowner cuts their grass, but also whether they even own their home. So on March 15th, 2021, New Orleans Mayor Cantrell signed a new law amending the city's existing grass cutting provision. The amendment lowered the maximum permitted grass height from 18 inches down, which was in the old law, down to 10 inches in the new law. If the city finds a homeowner's grass to be higher than 10 inches, it can grant the homeowner 5 days to cut the grass, or the city will do it for the homeowner. And the city will charge the homeowner between $300 at the minimum to several $1,000s per grass cutting. Grass cutting costs that are not paid after a year can become the equivalent of a property tax lien and enforced through the auctioning and forced selling of the house. On your screen right now is a map I took the screenshot in the fall of 2021, and it shows that almost 200 lots were being cut or in progress in the lower 9th Ward alone, which is part of New Orleans. Those are indicated by the orange dots. And the 9th Ward is indicated by that red line border. So some of you, can I just confirm, by the way, sorry, Michelle and Anna, you do see the map right now, right? I just sort of went through all these slides I should ask before, but.
Yeah.
Great, okay. So now, of course, some of you might be thinking, oh my gosh, zoning is so boring. Grass heights, my God, who cares, right? Who cares? Well, take a look at this. Here are two maps of New Orleans. The one on the left indicates the percentage of Black individuals per census block. The darker the blue, the higher the percentage of African Americans in the census block. The deepest dark blue on that map, again on the left, is between 88.8%, so almost 89%, and 100% African American. The map on the right shows in-progress cuts and the open cut cases around the entire city of New Orleans. The juxtaposition here of these two maps, I think, is a very stark one. The highest concentration of Black people in the city corresponds to the highest number of open cut cases. Conversely, the lowest concentration of Black people in the city, that's the lightest blue found in the northwestern portion, the southwestern portion, and the southeastern portion of the cities, have the fewest open cut cases. This provision illustrates the deceptive way that local land use laws influence major life determinants. A seemingly harmless, neutral law regulating an innocuous activity, grass cutting, can lead to a high cost, potentially $300 to potentially $1,000, but even the loss of one's home. And this is but one of thousands of zoning laws, regulating relatively minor details, influencing everything from how healthy your mother was when you were born to the date of your death, to whether you own your home and accumulate wealth. These laws dictate not only the physical landscape we see around us, but they lock in social and economic status. They create and support this system of winners and losers. And so to understand the covert ways in which zoning discriminates, it's instructive today, I'm talking about, so when we start to think about the covert ways that we see in zoning codes today, it's instructive to go back to the beginning of zoning. Right around the time of post-Reconstruction America, zoning was really being born. And it was partially born as a Jim Crow tool to segregate and discriminate. In 1910, 6 years before the first comprehensive zoning ordinance was enacted in New York City, which was in 1916. So 6 years before that, Baltimore passed the first explicitly racist zoning ordinance. And the newspaper from Baltimore, the front page, or the page about this is on your screen on the right there. And just as a note, which this is the story in which the law came about in Baltimore, is a very complicated one that brings together many different forces that were working across the nation at the time. But it's a fascinating one. If it's one you're interested in, it's part of a book I'm writing. I'd be glad to have a conversation about this. But I just note, just for those of you who are the poets in the audience, there is a gentleman in the middle of the screen. You can see his name. It says Mayor Barry Mahal. To the right of him is City Solicitor Edgar Allan Poe, not the poet. That's Edgar Allan Poe, his great nephew. And so he was the city solicitor of Baltimore, though, that approved this ordinance that stated that African Americans cannot purchase or lease a home on a block where the majority of individuals are white. Well, that was the first law to go through like that in the United States. It was 1910. It spread like wildfire across the country, particularly in areas of the South. I've highlighted Baltimore's on the screen now. You can see 1910, but I also highlight Louisville, Kentucky's. Louisville, Kentucky's was passed in 1914. That was the law that was challenged in that case that I described at the very beginning, that was ultimately struck down by the United States Supreme Court in 1917 in Buchanan versus Warwick. So why do we need to go back to this? Well, we need to go back to it because there were basically three ways that local governments then began to regulate land following Buchanan versus Warwick. Number one, some just simply ignored it. They pretended it did not exist, and they continued to pass and enforce explicitly racist zoning ordinance. Apopka, Florida, for example, had its unconstitutional segregation zoning ordinance enforced until 1968, almost 50 years after the decision. Birmingham, Alabama enforced its racial zoning ordinance until 1950. And West Palm Beach, Florida passed a race-based zoning ordinance in 1929, 12 years after Buchanan was decided. And it kept its ordinance on the book until 1960. So some just simply ignored it. Second, some tried to draft around it. Now, what they did here is they claimed that the decision, the Buchanan decision, was about property rights. They continued to pass race-based land use ordinances that did not directly involve property rights. So how did they do that? Well, a couple big examples. One was that they looked to planning. Now, a comprehensive plan, which is another step in regulating land use, but is different than zoning. Comprehensive plan, it was claimed for purposes of regulating by race, did not directly involve property rights because it was an idea of the city saying, this is what we want to be in 20 years, right? So it was just sort of almost hypothesizing and stating its ideal of what it wanted to be over time, but it wasn't directly affecting people's property rights. But so an example here, the Atlanta City Planning Commission passed a comprehensive plan 5 years after Buchanan that explicitly segregated lands by, among other things, dividing the city up into, quote, R1 white district and, quote, R2 colored district. But again, because this was a comprehensive plan, they claimed it didn't directly affect people's property rights. Another way that local governments did this was an example out of Richmond, Virginia, and it attempted to redefine zoning districts based on mixed marriages, saying if you had a mixed marriage, you could not live in these areas. All of these attempts were ultimately struck down, and it obviously took time to strike them down. But so these were all ultimately struck down. The third is that local governments crafted laws that did not explicitly mention race or ethnicity, but had a disproportionate and have a disproportionate impact based on race, ethnicity, or class. These are zoning provisions that hide behind a constitutional veil of neutrality, meaning they don't mention race, but they have a significant and detrimental impact based on race, ethnicity, or class. This one here, this last one, really lies at the heart of many zoning codes and many zoning provisions today. They include things like requirements for single-family homes, requirements for minimum lot sizes, requirement for minimum house sizes. These are all facially neutral, meaning they're not mentioning race in the words themselves, but have been shown to have a disproportionate impact based on race. They have also, this last one here, these facially neutral provisions that have a disproportionate impact based on race, they have been shown to be remarkably resistant to constitutional challenges. In a series of Supreme Court cases, 3 of the most important are on your screen: Washington versus Davis, Village of Arlington Heights, and Personal Administrator of Massachusetts versus Feenley. These cases, as well as others, the Supreme Court refused to hold that a law which is neutral on its face is invalid under the Equal Protection Clause simply because it may affect a greater proportion of one race than another. Rather, the court ruled that land use laws that are facially neutral will only be struck down if the plaintiff can show the local government passed the law, at least in part, because of, not merely in spite of, its adverse effects upon an identifiable group. So while we could read into these cases and parse out some of the language, the practical effect has been that communities across the country have adopted land use laws that are neutral on their face, but have a disproportionate impact based on race or class. And such laws cover a broad spectrum of issues. To give you a sense of the breadth of these issues covered and how we might change our approach to zoning to address health inequity, I'd like to look at 4 areas previously mentioned, where zoning can and has played a role in equity and health. For each of these areas, I'll describe some of the existing laws and then offer up some alternatives as to how we might begin to think about reform. So first, as again, Anna mentioned at the beginning, we'll start with citing of hazardous and toxic facilities. The nation noted last year that, quote, race is the most significant predictor of a person living near contaminated air, water, and soil. And then the other bullets I have on the screen lay out more of those numbers, but they're all the same. They all paint the same picture, which is that individuals of color are living much closer to Superfund sites, to hazardous waste sites, to oil refineries. In fact, here is the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, has a wonderful mapper where you can create a variety of different maps to compare who's living where and the relationship of where they are to many of these sites. The map on the right side of your screen shows the prevalence of people of color in Albany, New York. The darker the red, the higher the percentage of people of color. The map on the left shows proximity to Superfund sites. with red being the highest concentration of people close to a Superfund site, and dark yellow being the second highest. These maps illustrate that the location of people of color corresponds pretty clearly with Superfund sites in Albany, as in many areas across the country. Similarly, again, the map on the right is a map of the percentage of people of color, this time in Eastern New York. And the map on the left is population proximity to hazardous waste sites. Like Superfund sites, the two correspond pretty closely. And in many areas across the US, again, you can find maps like this as well. So what can we do about it? Well, some things to think about are first, make sure there is a better, more equitable distribution of future placements. And we do this by mapping where health and equity are factors in the jurisdiction. So that takes some time, but this is about correlating the individuals on the ground with what is actually being used on the ground and the quality of air, soil, and water. Now, of course, making sure that people of color are not only meaningfully participating in the creating of these maps, but are actively in place for purposes of decision-making and creating the criteria that will be used for the basis of the decision-making. Next, once we have these maps, so we know where the inequalities exist, we then begin to place the new facilities in locations with a more equitable distribution based on the mapping. This can be done in the comprehensive plan, it can be done in the zoning map, and it can be done in the zoning language. Now, a more difficult question is what to do about already cited facilities. For this, some cities are taking an old tool called amortization and putting it into a new use. Amortization is when a city determines that an existing use, like hazardous waste facility, are no longer permitted in the area they were once permitted. So I have three examples of a city taking this approach on the board here. The first is, by the way, as Anna mentioned, I run this thing called the Sustainable Development Code. All of the examples I'm going to talk about are either already on the website as part of the Sustainable Development Code, or they are from projects that are working through our editorial process and will be on the website relatively soon. National City, California is one example of a city that has used amortization to address the siting of these uses. So National City is about 88% people of color and has an asthma hospitalization rate that is 50% higher than just the county-wide. So not even looking at the nation, but just its county, it's 50% higher than its county. And it decided to use its amortization ordinance, existing one, to address facilities that are making air unhealthy for local citizens. Similarly, Dallas, Texas has successfully used its amortization provision to terminate smelting operation, which was located in the low-income, predominantly Hispanic community of Cadillac Heights. And Lauderdale, Florida provides that any scrap metal processing plant in a certain portion of the city is permitted to continue only until November 30th, 2025, and then it will be prohibited. Census data indicates that Lauderdale is almost 80% Black or African American. So there is one area where we can begin to think about using zoning to improve health in a more equitable manner. Of course, this is about unwanted uses. We might also want to consider incentivizing beneficial uses, such as hospitals, trying to find, again, mapping out where are the hospitals located. And not surprisingly, studies that have looked at this have shown that hospitals are not located in predominantly African-American areas. So incentivizing hospitals, incentivizing supermarkets, and other things. Which leads us to another area where zoning ordinances have a disproportionate impact, and that's around food security and sovereignty, food swamps, food deserts, and insecurity. A food swamp is an area in which large numbers of unhealthy, energy-dense food offerings inundate or swamp out the relatively few healthy food offerings. There's a lot of studies on food access and equality. Some of those studies indicate that African Americans are more likely to reside in food challenged areas. In 2020, 14.8% of households with children were food insecure. Food insecurity is defined as a lack of consistent access to enough food for every person in the household to live an active and healthy life. And this can be temporary or it can be permanent. More than 38 million people, including 12 million children, face food insecurity across the US. And again, a variety of statistics are also set up on the board, including the last one, 55% of Black individuals, 40% of low-income individuals, 42% of individuals without a high school diploma are at risk of nutrient deficiency or anemia. So in short, where healthy and affordable food options exist, individuals are less likely to be either obese or lacking nutrition. So let's look at a couple of different ways zoning is negatively impacting access and control over food and nutrition and healthy foods and how we might change some of that. So we'll look at this from a couple different perspectives. First, you can see in the first three bullets on the upper left side of the screen, it says current state, prohibiting production and prohibiting sale. So what we're finding in local zoning codes across the country is that many local governments are limiting production of fruits and vegetables and livestock on site. For example, they're prohibiting vegetable gardens in the front yards. They're limiting the type of gardens. They're limiting composting, accessory needs like fencing or equipment, and prohibiting various types of livestock. Related to that, many local governments are also prohibiting the sale of goods produced on site. And so that might be in the form of prohibiting just a sidewalk sale or a street cart, prohibiting a storefront, or even a farmer's market. In response, though, several local governments are removing these restrictions on growing fruits and vegetables and raising livestock. They're allowing more production on site as well. So for example, some jurisdictions are allowing bees, like Milwaukee. They're permitting fowl, like Christiansburg. They're permitting front yard gardens, like Columbus, Ohio. And they're also allowing accessory structures to help facilitate the production of fruits and vegetables. Local governments are also being more aggressive in permitting and opening up the ability for individuals to sell fruits and vegetables on site as a way of not only potentially earning some money, but also providing a service to the local community. And so some of the things we're seeing here is local governments permitting farmers markets in more districts. This is something like in Gastonia, North Carolina. Others are allowing producers to sell on site, as in Hopkinton, Rhode Island. And some are permitting sidewalk sales of fruit and vegetables, like in Passaic, New Jersey. Basically trying to make available fruits and vegetables as opposed to prohibiting the growth of fruits and vegetables. So that's one way to begin to think about bringing more fruits and vegetables to communities. But another big issue we need to think about, again, the current state is in the upper left, is what is there right now? And so what we're seeing right now in many jurisdictions is that zoning codes and zoning maps are not only permitting, but in some cases actively directing dollar stores, malt liquor stores, fast food, and others to be situated in areas that are predominantly populated by people of color. And conversely, there has been little or no incentive to promote supermarkets and healthy options in these areas. So how can we address this? Well, some local governments are looking at zoning as a way to either get rid of some of those existing uses, either through amortization or other tools, and then also incentivizing bringing on some. So some interesting things we're seeing out of Tulsa and Wyandotte County and Mesquite, Texas, is that they're prohibiting or limiting dollar stores, or they're requiring them to have a minimum amount of square footage of fresh fruits and vegetables in the store itself. Another more radical option is to think about food security and sovereignty in terms of reparations. Right now, we're seeing a couple reparation bills trickle through at the local level. For example, Evanston, Illinois offers $25,000 for a variety of home ownership options to those that previously were discriminated against by the city. But what about applying this same rationale to food? So we haven't seen this really percolate to the surface yet, but create deep incentives for supermarkets that are run and operated by the community, justified on the grounds that prior discrimination occurred in a way that essentially prohibited or made it very difficult for a supermarket to come to certain areas. Next, communities are addressing the poor state of pedestrian infrastructure in many areas. As we discussed before, Native Americans and African Americans are more likely to be struck by vehicles than white individuals. Some zoning provisions make it more difficult for individuals to walk. Those provisions include minimum parking requirements. This is where a local government tells a developer that you must build this many parking slots, and you must prioritize vehicular traffic over pedestrian or bicycle traffic. In response, local governments like Hartford, Connecticut, are eliminating parking requirements. Simultaneously, they're also increasing the tree canopy cover, which can provide not only shelter and a more pleasant place to walk, but also a physical barrier from cars as well as a host of other benefits related to climate change and biodiversity and stormwater management and others. But other jurisdictions are also doing something, and that is the prioritizing of pedestrian and bicycle mobility over vehicular traffic. So Chibolo, Texas, for example, has a program called Safe Streets, where they're making sure that individuals, particularly children, have safe access to get to and from school. But we can do this to and from work, and we can think about other ways and connecting to trails. So making trails not only a place to get great exercise and to go outside, but also trails to be utilized for purposes of getting to and from work or to the grocery store or other forms. All right, one more, and that's in terms of increasing home ownership and security. We might think of zoning codes as typically regulating things like area and use, which is very common for a zoning code to do. Both of these have significant impacts on home ownership rates. Take, for example, area. Many codes across the country have minimum square foot requirements for family residents. Many also establish minimum lot sizes in which the code says, if you want to build in this jurisdiction, you must have a 1 acre or 2 acre lot, or maybe a 5 acre lot. Both of these provisions, although facially neutral, often have a disproportionate impact based on both race and class. We might rethink these by taking a variety of steps that provide increased alternative housing options that can both drop the price and allow for different phases of a person's life to live in a given area. For example, some local jurisdictions are permitting tiny homes and compact living spaces. Examples here might be the tiny town of Spur, Texas, but also a large town like Fresno, California. On one hand, we might allow smaller homes, and on the other hand, in the second to the bottom bullet on the right side of your screen, we might set maximum size for single-family residence. In essence, trying to move the market in a certain direction. Examples here can be found in Palo Alto, as well as Austin, Texas. And just as some codes are limiting the size of residential homes, others are also removing large lot requirements. These examples based on area, as many of you know, zoning codes also regulate based on use. So for example, in the bullets under current state, some of the ways in which zoning codes regulate use are to require the single-family homes, or relatedly, they prohibit multifamily or mixed unit uses, or they prohibit accessory dwelling units. This is a a smaller unit that's connected to a single family house. In response to these use restrictions, which are often disproportionately impacting BIPOC and poor individuals, some jurisdictions are permitting multi-unit residences in formerly single-family districts. Others are permitting a variety of unit sizes within districts. Redmond, Washington, and Bainbridge Island, Washington are examples of this. And across the country, some examples in which we're seeing many jurisdictions look at homeownership differently through the lens of zoning. Now, I want to conclude with just a quick word on the infrastructure bill. Again, I'm not going to dive deep into it. There's a lot to it. But as we begin 2022, infrastructure bill funds are going to start to percolate their way into local government funding. Many of the issues embedded in the bill are zoning related. That includes $21 billion for pollution remediation, $11 billion for road safety with a focus on pedestrians, $1 billion for reconnecting former urban renewal abused communities, $55 billion for water infrastructure and others. But one of the things we want to be conscious of also is that the bill again takes a sort of neutral approach to about a third of its funding. This was an article that came out earlier this week, which says that over a third of the new funding for transit and other infrastructure needs will be awarded in competitive grants. This means cities with the capacity to draft eye-catching proposals are going to get the most attention. The article goes on to talk about how cities with larger budgets have more skill and are more adept and can put more money and time into these proposals and may in the end win these proposals when in fact they might be better served in other areas. So in closing, the idea behind zoning and zoning justice is to create a land use system that looks to have a more equal distribution of land uses, a better integration of all people in the land use process and decision-making, and a means to address past land use discrimination, particularly around areas of health. Thank you, and I very much look forward to your comments and questions.
There was an article in the New York Times today, which was talking about a place in the South where people did not have septic tanks. They had basically, what they called the pipe. And they were concerned that they weren't going to be able to get any of the federal funds because they, weren't powerful in the city government. What can people do about that?
Yeah, Anna, thanks for that. That's a great question and a great issue. The issue of sewer, and I didn't see the article in the New York Times, but this issue has been kicking around for a couple of years. Well, it's been kicking around for a couple of decades, several decades, but there was a really great New Yorker piece. If anyone's interested, you can email me and I'll get it to you, about 2 years ago, where someone dove down into a county, I believe it was in Georgia, and looked at this issue. And just like you said, these were areas where it was the pipe was the discharge, which basically means that it ran right into the backyard front yard where kids were playing, and the incidence of all sorts of fecal-borne diseases were much higher in those areas. And so what can we do about it? Well, there's a couple things that local governments can do to begin, if they don't, obviously getting the federal funds would be huge because you could connect to an actual sewer system, but assisting with things like district-wide septic systems, allowing community-based septic systems. Many jurisdictions prohibit community-based septic systems for a variety of reasons, but a number of districts have been able to draft an ordinance in a way that they are both safe and cost-effective, that allow many people to tap into a single system, septic system, and it's a much safer way to do it. So at the zoning level, we can allow a variety of different ways to think about how to dispose of sewage without going into a larger system. But right now, it's prohibited some of these ways.
So I'm getting the sense from your um, information that perhaps one of the best things people could do would be to get themselves on planning commissions and zoning boards, because those positions are often held by people who are, contractors or people who have a vested interest in what happens in their town.
Yes, and I'm not, and so there are layers of this. So first, for those of you that are familiar with the system of land use, it does vary by state. Most of it's governed by state law, and then it filters down to the local governments. And depending on state law, local governments have a variety of options. Sometimes they only have one option in terms of the process and the structure. But if we take, it sounds like, Anna, the system that you're talking about is you make an application to the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission reviews it. So one level that we would look at is, yes, getting people on a Planning Commission. Another level would be getting on a Board of Supervisors or a City Council that is responsible for creating the specific rules that direct the Planning Commission. So I served on the Planning Commission for the city of Des Moines. It's about a city of 210,000, the capital city of Iowa, for a number of years. And there were many times when our hands were tied. The city council passed the directive, the law, telling us how this particular issue, when it comes up, is to be dealt with. And so unless there was some other rationale for not following that, we had to follow that. So the Planning Commission, one level, City Council, Board of Supervisor, another level. And then, of course, there's always the state, right? The state, at the end of the day, has what's called preemption power over local governments, and they can pass laws. But that's not necessarily directly on the ground kind of things that we're talking about. But yes, get involved. It's the short story, I guess.
Thank you.
I see.
I can't unmute.
Oh, I was just looking very quickly at some of these. Some of the. Did you have a question, Anna? I was just looking at some of these, and I'm going backwards, but maybe I should go the other way. I should go from the earliest one first. But Dana has a astute comment that seems like facially neutral equals racist, and the response to that that you get, it depends on who's reading that, but one is yes, another is no. That's the whole point of facially neutral, is to say that it's not expressly discriminating based on race. But there's really a sort of a middle ground, right, that's really important to look at. And I think what you're referring to, right, is this idea that you may say something's neutral, right? We may have an open arms approach. Everyone's welcome here. But the fact is that, well, people can't get there. In fact, I was studying this one beautiful place on the Maine coast last summer. And I was looking at it for purposes of land use. And it's the same thing. It's got this beautiful, fabulous, open to the public cliff walk. You are more than welcome to attend the cliff walk and go to the cliff walk if you are doing one of a couple things. Number one, you can go to the cliff walk if you are parked in a parking lot for this really expensive clubhouse, this part of a golf course. Number two, you are one of what seemed to me something like 5 or 6 public parking spaces, all had meters. So if you get one of those 6, you're in a meter, and the meter, if you wanted to be there for, I think, about 4 hours, was about $20. There were no bike lanes. It was sort of a island peninsula kind of thing, and there was no public parking. So then I went back. I'm sorry, there was no public transit. So then I went back to my computer and I looked. Well, okay, so what about the people in the area? What if you want to live? If you live there, you can access it, right? The only thing I could find for sale was a lot, and it was not a particularly large lot. I don't remember how big, but it was something like 0.7 acres or something. And it was for $1.3 million, just a lot. And so, there's an example of what you're talking about. It's open to everybody, but we need to sort of pull the curtain back, as it were, and look at that, and really question each one of these. Are we moving forward in a way that's having disproportionate impact? Plus, are we addressing past harms as well?
You have 2 questions in the chat.
Okay, is that before it or after it? Maybe I'll just start from the beginning here. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Most recent.
Okay, all right. I love this comment about the Ninth Ward. We'll come back to that. Ileana. Okay, sorry, folks, I'm just catching up to it. All right, so the first one says, can we increase home ownership with co-housing communities, smaller homes with community meeting spaces? I think, Gene, that this is a great alternative. I don't think there's any single solution given the diversity of culture, geography, history, tradition across the United States, and all of these, there's 39,000 local governments in the United States, all these little pockets. I think we need to have a variety of tools, but I think co-housing communities, smaller homes, and as you said, with community meeting spaces are a fantastic option because they do a couple things, right? They allow the dropping of costs potentially, making it less of a barrier to enter into home ownership. In addition, they potentially help out with other co-forms of need, which may include employment or transportation, sewer, like we were talking about earlier, and other things. But I think it's important to note that we need a bunch of different tools. And then also, though, we need to think about, are these actually permitted? And many zoning codes won't even allow some of these things. Next question. Equity approaches to zoning. 2 questions. Any awareness of race-based property covenant use in Vermont? And so, Jonathan, if I'm misinterpreting the question, please clarify. Number one, great question. So, what we're talking about here, again, the question is any awareness of race-based property covenant use in Vermont. And what I believe we're talking about here are covenants either in a deed or covenants as a group covenant among individuals where we're cross-covenanting and saying, you won't sell to... Oh, yeah, we got it, Jonathan. Did you want to clarify it all, Jonathan? Okay, so first of all, these covenants were obviously prohibited, not obviously, but they were prohibited, they were made unlawful, first of all, by the United States Supreme Court in a case called Shelley versus Kramer in the mid-1940s. However, they persisted, and in many instances, the federal government even continued to require them for purposes of backing loans in some developments. And so they persisted until the 1968 Fair Housing Act made it crystal clear that they were prohibited. They were unlawful under federal law. Now, that said, Jonathan, I'm not aware of it in Vermont, but that's only because I haven't looked. I would be shocked if there weren't some in Vermont. Because they're almost everywhere. I mean, they're everywhere that I've ever actually looked for it. The only question is, can you find them, right? Can because you have to go in back, you have to go into the deed, or you have to look at the cross covenants that were filed, which would have been at this point at least 50 years ago. So I haven't looked at it, but I would be surprised if we couldn't find one. Number 2, I have a situation where there's a proposal to remove some on-street parking, replace it with a bike lane, and some advocates for households experiencing low-income need and want plentiful supply of off-street parking to maintain plenty access to necessary jobs that may not be accessible by transit, walking, or biking. However, in the geography of interest, there is clear evidence that those who are Black, Asian, as well as households experiencing low income own fewer vehicles on average, take transit, walking, and biking. Any thoughts? Well, there's a lot packed in there, and it's not an uncommon issue. There's a couple forces at play there, right? The big one, it sounds like you're wrestling with, is this idea of two competing, potentially really important needs. One is the idea of adding bike lanes to make transportation less expensive, and also to reduce greenhouse gases and have other positive environmental impacts. And the other is to make sure that we can create a place of, it sounds like, low-cost parking for purposes of people transiting into a particular area. It's interesting, it's a little bit different than some of the discussions I've seen on this before, which are more about a conflict between some environmental issue like the bike lanes versus affordable housing and whether or not gentrification will take hold, or other kinds of issues. This particular one, I'm not sure, Jonathan. We could talk offline to kind of work through some ideas to figure out what's the sticking point for some people. Because as you noted, there's clear evidence that certainly African Americans have a much higher percentage rate of taking public transportation than white individuals. That's pretty well documented. And in addition, that it's a matter of lowering cost. That said, it sounds like there might be something else at play here that I'm just not necessarily familiar with. Okay, let's go to the next one. Says, can we increase homeowner? Oh, we got that. Okay, so now we have another. Oh, by the way, Anna has put into the text chat, if you haven't seen it, I think there was a race ethnicity-based covenant in Greensboro for a property purchased by then Chief Justice Rehnquist. Yeah, these are great. These are fantastic points and great questions. So before we go to Tom's point, which is a great one and a great question, I do just want to go up to an earlier comment that was made, and there was a bunch. I hate to miss the earlier ones just because they were early. First, again, Jonathan, thanks not only for your comment, but also Jonathan has put in the chat the Richmond's redlining project, which is really, they did a great job, and you can again click into many of those. Okay, so let's see, Eliana, the lower Ninth Ward was also the hardest hit by the levee breaches from Hurricane Katrina, causing the destruction of generational wealth and thousands of homes that have yet to be recovered. Only 39% of pre-Katrina homeowners in the low Ninth Ward have returned to their homes versus citywide 90% rate of return. I didn't know about the grass cutting regulations. The only thing sorry, go ahead, Anna.
Go ahead.
The only thing I wanted to add to Eliana's point was that what's fascinating about her point is that the first grass cutting ordinance was passed right after Hurricane Katrina. And the idea was that people weren't coming back fast enough. And so this was one of the ways that New Orleans was going to incentivize, apparently, people to come back to their district. And as was noted, this ordinance really made it people not want to come back, particularly in the Ninth Ward, where they may be facing thousands of dollars in grass cutting fees. Okay, Tom has again a great point and a great question. Your presentation gave us a good overview with lots of great examples. Can you expand on how these issues apply in Vermont? In some ways, poverty is a larger issue than race, and disparities are often measured by town rather than by neighborhood, which reduces the role of zoning. It's a great, great point. First of all, yes, your point about class as opposed to race or ethnicity in Vermont is, I think, dead on. I think in Vermont, we have a huge challenge with trying to figure out ways in which the zoning code can lessen the gap between, as opposed to expanding the gap between the wealth and income of those in the lowest class base and the highest class base. And I think you've all probably seen the charts in terms of wealth and income in the United States and how those gaps are getting bigger. Obviously, many of those are based on other things like the tax code and others, but zoning can play a measure, can play a role. And so some of the things to think about are very much about the home ownership portion of the presentation. And so we could talk about some of that in more detail. Other ones to think about, though, would be around employment. So current zoning codes often prohibit employment in areas. Like you cannot have employment running out of your residential home. So getting rid of some of that, increasing mixed uses. And I'm not necessarily talking about mixed use in gentrified areas of a city. They're trying to make them hip and cool. I'm talking about mixed uses in a way that, again, allow people to live and work in similar places so that they can have a kind of, they can have employment in the place. Another would be looking at the types of employment that may be in an area and allowing some of that to happen as well. So whether that's agricultural based, or maybe it's nursing based, or maybe it's some other service based role, but allowing that to happen. So housing and employment are two big ones that come to mind. After that, I think we'd really want to kind of sit down and think about what are some of the key issues that continue to plague low-income individuals in Vermont, and how we can address those head-on through the zoning code again. And I think there's probably a number of ways in which that's happening. Then was there another part of this, though, that I wanted to talk about? Oh, and the last part, which again, I think is a really interesting and good point, and that's that disparities are often measured by town rather than by neighborhood, which reduces the role of zoning. That's an interesting point. I mean, I think that it kind of is one that cuts both ways, in that on one hand, it reduces the role of zoning. And by that, I suspect you mean, Tom, and at least this is the way that I would characterize it, is that one local jurisdiction can't reach into another local jurisdiction and start zoning in that government, right? So that sort of limits the power of the jurisdiction to affect rules by zoning. But another way to think about it is, well, what do we have available? And what can we do in our jurisdiction? First of all, let's get rid of the barriers, right? Let's get rid of all these things I just talked about concerning food or housing or employment, pedestrian mobility. Let's get rid of the things that are making it more difficult, more expensive in our jurisdiction. And then second, let's start to incentivize the things that we want or can bring. That we can do through zoning. Now, of course, the state is the one that can really address some of these interlocal conflicts head on, but typically states avoid some of that stuff. A really great, again, a great point by Dana. It would be interesting to talk about the facial neutral zoning in Vermont, which impact people with less financial resources. And yes, first of all, that would be fabulous, right? It would be fabulous to do a deep dive into 20 jurisdictions, diverse jurisdictions in Vermont that go into their zoning codes and identify these facially neutral provisions. And we can look at it, as you know, and Tom notes, about based on class, or we can look at it based on race. I mean, they're also, you know, we're talking about class being important because it's the landscape we see. right? But we should also think about race as a matter of, well, why aren't we more diverse? Right? What is it that's not welcoming in Vermont? And is that something we should think about? So then we say, then Dan says, like my neighborhood doesn't allow the single family homes to be divided into rentals. Exactly. This ties my hands and is based on some assumption that these neighborhoods want to avoid something which is arguably about income and race. Feel that Vermont is good at keeping their policies very neutral, but the impact is the same. You know, what's also interesting about this, in 1926, the United States Supreme Court, in a case called Euclid versus Ambler, maybe some of you are familiar with this. Excuse me, the Supreme Court upheld zoning for the first time. That was the first time the United States Supreme Court said, under the Constitution, local governments can zone. In that case, the petitioner wanted to build his property as industrial property, and the jurisdiction said, no, you can't. We want it to be residential property. So the case was about industrial versus residential property. Notwithstanding that, Justice Sutherland, in what's called dicta, which is when the court essentially goes off on a tangent, talks about something that is not directly on point for the case or not law for the case, in dicta, on his own, decides to have a quasi rant about apartment complexes. He calls apartment complexes parasites. He says the good children over here who live in the single family homes need to be protected. Their air, their light, their water needs to be protected from these parasites over here that are living in the apartment complexes. And the reason I point that out is because, you know, here is the birth of zoning, or at least the constitutional recognition of zoning. And the court is making it crystal clear that facially neutral provisions that say no apartment complexes are okay. And so again, it just sort of, you know, that is being echoed 100 years later in, and I think Dana's comment here, or Dana. Marguerite says, a number of Superfund sites are decommissioned or current military sites and bases. Often lower income communities surround these bases. How do you get the military to do the right thing and clean up their messes? This isn't so much a zoning issue, but it affects communities that surround the bases. Absolutely, Marguerite. Yeah, it's a great point. I mean, first of all, like a lot of these issues, zoning doesn't operate in a vacuum, in that it's impacted by other local laws, state law, and federal law. And as you know, this particular one is federal law. And so how do you get them to do that? Boy, that's a tough one. You need federal support, right? You know, what would be interesting, you know, I'm not overly familiar with this, Marguerite, but it might be interesting to look at, you know, the old Fort Devens in Massachusetts. You know, that was a military site, and it became its own autonomous entity, quasi-autonomous. It's still part of 3 local governments as well. It's got this really interesting local government structure, but it might be interesting to see if that did have a cleanup associated with it, and then reaching out to them and saying, well, how did they do that? How did they get that done? Wonderful. And I think I'm at the end of the comments. I think I looked at them all.
I think so too. I've been looking at them and I think you hit them all. Thank you so much. I just, I can't understand why we're not talking about zoning all the time.
You know, Michelle, just a quick little story. One time I wrote this article, and the first line was zoning ... And I have my wife read everything. She's a great editor, super smart. So I have her read everything. She didn't even get through the first sentence, and she said, "You cannot start an article with zoning."
I feel like I learned so much. I feel like from what the comments are, I feel like we just didn't know how important it is. And I feel like the questions were excellent. What a great community we have. And we're able to really tease out, even more. So thank you so much. It just was a really great presentation.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for your questions.
Yeah, thanks everyone for being here with us tonight. Can we get the slides?
I can certainly forward them if you can get them to your constituents. I'm glad to forward them to you and Anna.
Sure
Michelle.
thing. What I can do is if you give them to me, I can put them on the Kellogg Hubbard Library website with the video.
Okay.
So if people want to see them, you can go to the adult programs page of the Kellogg Hubbard Library website and they'll live there.
Great.